going to chat to us about all things that relate to sleep, because we see all the social media posts and news articles about how important sleep is for us. But often we don't have a really evidence-based context and practical information. And so I hope that Dale is going to enlighten us all. She's got a globally recognized expertise in her field. As Dale, how many PhDs are you supervising now and masters? It must be a dozen or so from the number of students that I see walking around that are supervised by her. But Dale is prolific at the moment in terms of her research, amongst many other things as well. And so I'm going to hand over to her, and she can tell us all about the expertise that she has. And then afterwards, we're going to have the usual Q&A where we can ask her some specific questions, which I'm sure that her talk will generate. Dale, are you able to share your slides?
Yeah, I'll do that now. Cool.
Great, okay. Thank you. Then I'm going to hand over to you. Welcome, everybody, and till afterwards.
Great. Thank you very much, Tarun. And yeah, thanks for the invitation to come and chat to you all about sleep. It's going to be a little bit of a sort of a journey story, I think. So there'll be a little bit about the history of sleep, a little bit about like what it is exactly, and then what do we know in terms of how it impacts our overall health, well-being, and a little bit on athletic performance as well. So kind of diverse, and I'm going to go kind of quickly, but I hope it's interesting. Cool. I'm just sharing my screen. Good. You should be able to see that.
We can. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, good. Okay, so I entitled the talk Sleep, whether it's a genuine silver bullet for health, well-being, and performance. And then I kind of feel a bit uncomfortable with that heading now in our current time. So massive apologies about that. But anyway, let's see if we can get past that. All right, so if we go back in time, sleep is something that has been looked at in different ways, but really very often historically, it's played a part in many ancient cultures or societies and even religions, and but very much sort of from a dream perspective. And I would say that really initially it was the psychologists who often really took a lot of interest in sleep. And if we go back into ancient Egyptian texts, we see that they're already mentioning this condition known as insomnia, and in fact that they were using opium as a way to induce sleep. Hippocrates in his text refers to disordered sleep and dreams, and the Greeks and the Romans worshipped gods associated with sleep like Hypnos and Somnus as well. From a scientific perspective, the very first journal article that was published in sleep was in 1810. And you can see here that from the title, it was a bit of a catch-all paper. It was called Of Sleep, Its Utility, Causes, Varieties, Perturbances, Defects, Excess, or Irregularities, and the Rationale and Cause of Dreams. It's like, let's just put everything into one paper and get it out there. So that was really interesting. A couple of the sort of notes that came out of that were that the length of sleep depends much upon age, constitution, habit, and in short, the state of the body when sleep has stolen. The cause of sleep, or at least its ultimate and proximate cause, is at present unknown and will probably remain a secret. And then hence, for the purpose of preserving life and health, sleep is not only useful, but altogether necessary. And so even then in 1810, with very little scientific background, so many of these statements are absolutely bang on when it comes to what we understand about sleep today. Sorry, my thing sometimes does this. It keeps dropping. I'm just going to go back to the share. Sorry. So if that happens again, I will just have to keep popping out to get that share working again. All right. So there was a little bit of sort of research that sort of trundled along pretty cautiously. In 1845, there was one of the first sort of studies that had a look at the connection between body temperature and sleep patterns. So this was a move away from the sort of dreamings and the psychological type of work. And in 1913 was the very first study where sleep was looked at as a health-related issue, which was quite important.
Sorry, Dan, we seem to have lost your screen share again.
Sorry, I don't know why it keeps
came back and then it disappeared.
Yeah, I hope it's not my connection. Sorry about that. This was happening the other day. I've had no idea what this is about. Sorry, guys. Okay, that's back on. Let's hope it stays there for a while. So what was quite a pivotal point was that in 1924, Hans Berger was the first person to use EEG to study sleep. And that really changed the way that we could examine sleep as a physiological phenomenon. And shortly afterwards, Nathaniel Kleitman opened the very first sleep lab at the University of Chicago. And that's where, again, the research around sleep was beginning to gain traction. In 1965, sleep apnea was characterized as a disorder. So that was the second known sleep disorder that emerged then. And a journal entirely dedicated to sleep emerged in 1978. And it was actually only as recently as 1996 that sleep medicine was recognized by the American Medical Association. And then it's basically since the sort of 2000s, early 2000s, there's been an absolutely exponential increase in the sleep-related research, which is really exciting, and it sort of more or less coincides with my own journey in sleep research. So on one hand, this has been exciting because we are learning so much more about sleep beyond just sort of dream and the psychological context, not that those aren't important. But what it's also meant is that that coupled with the explosion of wearables, which are tracking people's sleep, is that in the lay media, there really is much to do about sleep. And I think Matthew Walker is, or at least with his book, he's definitely, I want to be careful what I say here. He's created a sort of a whole following, if you like, around the importance of sleep. It's almost a little bit of a cult. Which on one hand is exciting because, people are saying, we need to pay attention to sleep. But on the other hand, it's also creating, I think, quite a lot of fear around the potential for not getting sufficient good quality sleep. Certainly in my sleep clinic, we quite often see people who come to us and say, I've read Matthew Walker's book and my sleep's terrible. I'm definitely going to be dying soon. And so there's it's got, I think, sometimes potential to do a little bit more harm than good. But I guess nevertheless, at least the message is getting out there around the importance of sleep, because typically there have certainly been people who really wear short sleep as a badge of honor, and it makes you sort of think about the importance of sleep. So a couple of years back, Steve Harvey in his talk show made this rather infamous statement that rich people don't sleep 8 hours a day, basically saying like that's a third of your life. And if you're asleep, other people are getting ahead. And that created a huge amount of debate around whether or not we should be prioritizing sleep. And again, looking back over time, we can see rather impressive characters who were notorious short sleepers. And very often we, in today's sort of entrepreneurial and sort of corporate world, we certainly see people who are presenting as very, very short sleepers. And it's kind of the thing, well, I'm very, very important. I'm super busy. I don't have time for sleep. And I mean, yeah, there are people who are buzzing by on somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of sleep per night, which is crazy. I think it's interesting to see that athletes take a totally different view on that. And so whether it's Usain Bolt mentioning that sleep is key for him to recover from his training sessions, and Michael Phelps noting that it's actually the quality of sleep that's really important too. Basically, these very opposing views really beg the question, does sleep really matter? And if we think about it, just like we need water and food for survival, well, so the same is true for sleep. It's definitely been preserved throughout evolution, and therefore we can only conclude that it's beneficial, even if we don't yet fully understand its significance. Because it doesn't matter if we're speaking about the tiny fruit fly or the great big orca whale, sleep is critical for every single organism on our planet. So we don't know a huge amount about exactly why we sleep or what happens when we sleep, but what we have sort of put together now is that sleep is critical for neural plasticity. So essentially all of the neural pathways that we make use of during the daytime are reinforced at nighttime. So this, on one hand, is critical, of course, from a cognitive perspective, because it's important for embedding memories and helping with learning. Sorry about that, guys. This is going to be so frustrating. Here we go. But it's also important from a motor learning perspective, because at every sort of skill or movement that we might do on a given day with sleep, those pathways are reinforced, which of course from an athletic perspective is key. There's a really important lymphatic function that has recently come to fore during sleep as well. And that relates to the when a person sleeps, it seems that the volume of the brain is minutely reduced to allow for an increase in cerebrospinal fluid to flow around the brain to remove metabolic byproducts and toxins that might have built up during the day as a result of metabolic functions. And so this is a critical function. And specifically, what has come to light recently is there's a lot of interest around accumulation of beta amyloid in the brain. And the logic is that it seems that individuals with neurodegeneration, like Alzheimer's, for example, seem to have higher accumulations of beta amyloid than those of people whose brains do not yet show signs of neurodegeneration. And the question is being asked is, if we don't have sufficient time to sleep, are we shortchanging this lymphatic function essentially during sleep, which is critical for removing things like beta amyloid? And then could that mean that we are accelerating our decline into the inevitable neurodegeneration, which is obviously associated with aging? And so that is currently under investigation. Oddly enough, when we sleep, we save energy. So essentially, the longer we're awake for or the more we sleep, the less we need to eat. It's a bit of a strange sort of function to think about today when we have sort of 24/7 access to food. But be it as it may, that seems to be one of the functions. We also restore our brain and other energy stores. And then there's a critical component around supporting immunity for sleep. So it's not exactly as simple as this, but if we imagine that when we are awake, our innate immune system is primary, or the components of our innate immune system are primarily active, so that defending us against the pathogens that we may come into contact with during our waking hours. When we're asleep, it seems that the adaptive components of our immune system become more active. On one hand, making sure that damaged or mutated cells are destroyed. And then on the other hand, also that's a lot of the time when many of the antibodies that we need to make are built as well. So essentially, sleep is critical from an immunity perspective. And then really the thing that we're most familiar with is that sleep reverses performance losses associated with extended wakefulness. So you can identify with the longer you're awake for, I call it, the more useless we become. We kind of become slow, lethargic. We're not so good at multitasking anymore. We don't really feel like exercising or moving, etc. And all of that relates to an increase in something called sleep pressure, which is linked to an accumulation of adenosine in the brain with sort of the more hours that we've been awake for. And fortunately, this is all reversed with sleep, so that we can essentially press the reset button and be invigorated following a good night of sleep. So I mentioned earlier that sleep is critical for survival, and obviously the experiments have not been able to be conducted in humans, but from animal models, we understand that with total continued wakefulness, which we call total sleep deprivation, death is inevitable somewhere in the realm of between 5 and 30 days. And interestingly, from those animal experiments, there's two things that really stand out for me. One is the variation in how long different individual animals take to die, which I think suggests that we have different vulnerabilities to, or a resilience to sleep deprivation, which makes sense to me. And the second thing was that when we looked at their different organs and systems which began to fail as they approached death, it was really, really broad or wide ranging. And so it also suggests to me that all systems are vulnerable to the effects of sleep deprivation, and it's just a matter of which systems fail first as to what the outcomes are going to be. Just out of interest, the human record for staying awake belongs to Robert MacDonald, who set this as a Guinness World Record in 1986 by keeping himself awake for just over 18 days. Should note that that record has been stopped from 1997 as they looked at the inherent dangers associated with sleep deprivation. So most of us don't go around trying to completely neglect sleep. We may pull an all-nighter and experience 1 or 2 nights of total sleep deprivation, or more likely, we sort of subject ourselves to 1 or 2 weeks of partial sleep restriction. So that's just getting insufficient sleep by a couple of hours each night. But even those acute sleep deprivation models, both of those impair cognition and already have an impact on aspects of our physical and mental health. So, for example, in both of these instances, sorry. There we go. With partial sleep restriction or 1 or 2 nights of complete sleep deprivation, you'll notice that your ability to think with agility is compromised. We can't pay attention so long. We're not so good at problem solving or doing deep thinking. It immediately starts to impact our ability to learn and our memory consolidation. Your mood is typically worsened, not necessarily that you would immediately start to feel down, but certainly we find it more difficult to regulate emotion. It starts to impact immediately on growth and repair of cells, has an acute effect on our metabolism by promoting insulin resistance, for example, and starts to dampen our immune responses as well. So given that we know a little bit about some of the effects of sleep deprivation, we're obviously now also interested in, okay, well, what does optimal sleep look like? Well, very obviously, people immediately start to think about, well, how much sleep should I be getting? It's super easy to track and monitor, I suppose. And so these guidelines were developed by the National Sleep Foundation in the US. And the guidelines were based on all of the available studies which looked at how much sleep people would need to promote optimal physical and mental health. And so quite obviously, the amount is massive when we're looking at newborns and decreases through childhood into adolescence. And this is primarily just to support growth and development. Once we reach our sort of young adult years, you can see here that the recommendations are that most adults will need in the realm of 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And I think that's really important because it's not that everybody needs 8 hours. That's actually such a misconception. Because these guidelines also suggest that for some people, 6 is all that they require, and others need as much as 10 or 11. So there's actually a 4-hour range, or approximately, in terms of what a person's sleep need might be. Of course, there'll be a bell-shaped distribution to this, and there'll be relatively few people who can get away with 6 or who I view as being unlucky enough to need 10 or 11. And so if you are a 9-hour sleeper and you're sleeping 7 hours, it might be within the range, but you're going to end up being chronically sleep deprived. So that's sort of what we understand about our sleep duration. But as Michael Phelps suggested earlier, it's not just the duration that's important, it's quality. So sleep quality is actually a really odd term because there isn't a single measure for sleep quality. So when we think about what makes our sleep good, we think about things like, well, how much time am I spending in the different important sleep stages? How regular is my sleep? And what about my sleep timing? So those are factors that speak to quality of sleep. When it comes to sleep staging, the best way to assess this is to do an overnight study using a technique called polysomnography. And essentially here we have electrodes looking at EEG, we have EMG, EOG, and also we look at like respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, etc. And we are able to put together all of this information and develop a little picture like this, which is called a hypnogram, which tells us about the structure or the architecture of a person's sleep based on the electrical activity in the brain, which based on the EEG patterns, we're able to decide if a person is in certain stages of sleep. So, for example, a person will lie awake a little bit as they try to fall asleep at night. That's called sleep onset latency. Then they'll go down into what's called non-REM stage 1. And this is super light. And here, if I were to try to wake a person up, they would swear that they were just lying there resting and that they hadn't yet fallen asleep. But it is actually the first part of sleep. It's very light, high levels of consciousness, and it's really a transitionary phase, taking us down into non-REM stage 2. So this is really good sleep now. And here, if we were to try to disturb a person, they wouldn't wake up, but their brain would register that they had been disturbed. and then we'll transition to non-REM stage 3, and this is our slow wave or our deep sleep. And here a person's level of consciousness is super, super low, so it's difficult to wake a person from this stage of sleep. And then they'll pop up and have a little bout of what we call slow REM, rapid eye movement sleep over here. And in this case, we have a very busy brain. It looks much like a wake brain, and the eyes are darting around. But there is muscle atonia, so that a person essentially can't move, because what can happen then is with breakthrough movement is that we can have some REM-related sleep disorders, and we might actually move or act out what's happening in our head in this very busy stage of sleep. So this is essentially a sleep cycle where we flip between non-REM stages and REM. Each of these cycles takes about 90 to 100 minutes, and we'll do about 4 or 5 of them throughout the night. But what you'll notice in the first part of the night, we do most of our slow wave sleep. So this is to relieve our sleep pressure, and our bursts of REM extend significantly through the night. So the bulk of our REM sleep is happening in the latter parts of the night. There's also a natural waking point at around 1 or 3 in the morning at the midpoint of our sleep. It's quite normal for everybody's sleep to kind of be divided into 2 and to have this natural waking point. And then what we understand is that our slow wave sleep is where we secrete a lot of testosterone and growth hormone, and this is critical for physical repair and recovery, whereas REM sleep is important for mental alertness, emotional and psychological recovery. And in fact, animal studies have shown that when these animals are selectively deprived of REM sleep, the outcome during the course of the experiment is actually death. So our bodies prioritize REM sleep very, very strongly, and we often see problems with people taking certain medications which suppress REM sleep. Sorry, I'm fixing the share now. That when the medication is removed, then they will go into what's called REM rebound, as their body tries desperately to pay back that REM sleep that they need. And if a person has had insufficient sleep, even if you're a REM sleep, you'll notice that you feel really, really out of sorts. So we think it's super important for emotional regulation. And then when it comes to things like memory, so the neural connections that we need to put memory into both short term, but then also to consolidate it. These take place specifically in both slow wave and in REM sleep. So both of them are critical from a cognitive perspective. Approximately over the course of the night, we should spend about half of our night in non-REM stage 2. About a fifth of our night should be in slow wave or deep sleep, and approximately a quarter of our night we should be spending in REM or rapid eye movement sleep. The next stage of sleep quality relates to regularity, and this is a little actogram which shows a person's sleep patterns obtained from wearing a little wrist-worn device, and you can see that this is the course of a week. Each one of these rows is a 24-hour period, and the blue bits are the person's sleep period. So this person is super regular compared to this person here who has a pretty erratic sleep pattern, quite a lot of variation in the timing of their sleep as well as the duration. And we have recently learned that regularity is probably as important, if not more important than sleep duration when it comes to overall physical health. And so we ask people to consider being more regular than erratic. Why is regularity important? Well, we think that irregular sleep probably disrupts circadian rhythm, so creates quite a lot of desynchronization between our various organs, essentially, and we think this has a really strong impact on our metabolism. The other thing to consider now that we're thinking along the lines of circadian rhythms is the time of day at which we're designed to sleep. Well, we're diurnal creatures, which means more or less we should sleep at night, but there's a lot of variation within our optimal sleep timing, and it really depends on our own body clock or circadian rhythms, and whether or not we are classified more as a morning person or an evening person, or whether we're somewhere in between the neither types. So I'm sure that many of you can identify with these kind of little cartoons where that morning person is somebody who bounces out of bed with loads of energy, is generally hungry in the morning, loves to exercise in the morning, and loves to do all of their thinking work in the morning. Whereas that evening type is pretty sullen, doesn't have an appetite, hates exercising, and is definitely not going to be doing any deep thinking work in the beginning of the day, whereas at the end of the day, roles are reversed. And so this phenomenon, which we call chronotype, is a product of our bodies, of various variations within our clock genes, which establish whether we are more morning or evening oriented, but we really exist along a sort of a continuum, if you like, and many people are in the middle, which is sort of this neither type. And why this is important is that the optimal sleep for any given person is that which lines up nicely with their body clock. So evening types, for example, would have a much preferred and optimal later sleep timing, often with bedtime being around midnight 1 and preferring to sleep until 8 or 9 or even 10 the next day. And so enabling sleep to occur in sync with your body clock is a very important aspect of sleep quality. And then the last part of sleep quality that's important is that continuous sleep is obviously better than disrupted sleep. And this is shown quite nicely in this little study here, which in the first instance gave people 3 nights of continuous sleep. So they were given a 7.5-hour sleep opportunity. And in this opportunity, they were 92% efficient. So that meant of the time that they were in bed trying to sleep, they were actually asleep 92% of the time. In the second scenario, they were given a 7.5-hour sleep opportunity, but they kept getting woken up so that they only accumulated around 4 to 4.5 hours of sleep per night. And then in the third scenario, they were given 3 nights of short sleep, so just 4 to 4.5 hours of sleep per night. Obviously, they were super efficient then because they were pretty knackered. And what they observed is that if you were in scenario 2, you had sufficient sleep opportunity, but you had very fragmented and broken sleep. You actually got less slow wave sleep, and the following day you had lower positive mood as well. So we'll take shorter consolidated sleep over longer fragmented sleep any day of the week. So all in all, this gives us a little bit of insight as to what healthy sleep might be. So it's important that we have sufficient sleep duration. And so we don't really, it's difficult to know exactly like what is your sleep sweet spot in terms of duration, but we certainly can gauge it by our levels of daytime functioning, because that's really what we care about. How well do we function in the day? How alert are we? I don't want to have any fatigue or sleepiness. And so if we have optimal levels of daytime functioning with minimal fatigue or sleepiness, we're probably pretty close to getting sufficient sleep duration. Signs that we might not quite be getting it right is when we do catch-up sleep on weekends. So that's extending our weekend sleep by more than an hour and a half. Or if we are heavily reliant on daytime naps, that would also suggest that our sleep duration is insufficient. Our sleep should be consistent in terms of timing and duration and more or less in sync with our circadian rhythms as well as the light-dark cycle. And sleep should come easily. So a healthy sleeper can fall asleep easily, stay asleep, and importantly, can sleep without medication. So that's a summary of healthy sleep. When it comes to sleep disorders or disordered sleep, we can look at this from different perspectives. There might be some parasomnias, which can be contributing to sleep challenges. And these are unusual behaviors that people experience, usually just prior to falling asleep or sometimes during sleep as well. Sorry, wait, I'm so sorry about this, guys. I don't know why my laptop is doing this recently. And our parasomnias can be linked to either non-REM or REM sleep. So examples of non-REM parasomnias might be sleepwalking, for example, or REM-related parasomnias could be sleep paralysis or nightmare disorder. Then we have formal sleep disorders, most common being insomnia, followed by obstructive sleep apnea, and then restless leg syndrome, periodic limb movements, and also narcolepsy. The last part of sort of classic sleep disorders would be those related to a disrupted body clock. And so we call these circadian related sleep disorders. And these are what we observe with shift workers, which is actually formerly a sleep disorder, in fact, called shift work sleep disorder, advanced or delayed sleep-wake phase disorders. So these are people who are extreme night owls or morning persons whose innate sleep patterns are completely at odds with the environment. For many people, however, it's not really sleep disorders that are at bay, but it's either it's external factors which are contributing to disordered sleep, which then presents with symptoms that are insomnia-like. So many medical conditions or medications can impact sleep and create sleep disruptions and patterns that look like insomnia-type patterns. Many psychiatric conditions and their medications thereof also impact sleep, very often reducing REM sleep specifically, and these often create a lot of problems related to poor sleep. But for the most part, what people typically do, it's a little bit self-imposed, and these can be behavior, lifestyle, or stress-related factors that can disorder sleep, linked to excessive caffeine use, for example. High stress may be related to work and other factors. And so if we look at risk factors for poor sleep, some of them include sort of the classics, too much caffeine, too much alcohol, and recreational drugs. Typically stimulants, so caffeine and stimulants are going to typically create a lot of arousals during sleep, which can often then limit the amount of time we spend in slow wave or deep sleep. Whereas alcohol, for example, also creates excessive alcohol use also creates a lot of arousals, but also impacts the amount of REM sleep as well as the amount of slow wave sleep that a person has. And that's the same for other central nervous system depressants. Working shifts can obviously impact sleep massively. Jet lag or transmeridian travel, and then the ensuing jet lag disrupts sleep, of course. And more recently, we're sort of observing sort of big social factors that impact sleep. So especially related to connecting on social media, which often then competes with sleep time. There are environmental factors that are important related to light and temperature. Is a big thing that is being investigated now, and also noisy environments, of course, impact sleep as well. The psychosocial factors related to stress or worry or depression, and then being caregivers as well, obviously can impact sleep. And then, as I've mentioned, a number of medical conditions and, of course, unmanaged sleep disorders are all things that are likely going to disrupt sleep. For many of us, though, it is often linked to stress. This has got to be the number one ruiner of sleep in the absence of any formally diagnosed sleep disorder. So high levels of stress during the daytime often then lead to something called rumination at nighttime. So you're absolutely knackered, you lie down, close your eyes, and your brain just turns on and starts to loop. And very often sort of itching or worrying away at various problems. And this is very often a pretty difficult cycle to break. This, of course, reduces sleep opportunity, and we accumulate sleep debt with this, and run the risk of burnout, which is pretty common amongst most people at some point in their life. The next most common problem that we're experiencing now related to sleep is the effects of light at night. And so I love this little image here of one of NASA's satellites that was taken. It took 312 orbits of this little satellite in order to create this image. But you can see that at nighttime, we're twinkling like a star ourselves. And even down here in Cape Town, we're not immune. And William Dement, who's really like the godfather of sleep medicine, in his book, The Promise of Sleep, wrote that our loss of sleep time and natural sleep rhythms is the tragic legacy of a single profound technology advance, the light bulb. And he said that basically Edison's light bulb overrode the natural order of the world, creating new environmental patterns of light and dark that have often played havoc with human sleep patterns. And obviously, with us having experienced load shedding, nobody's going to say, yeah, we should sort of forego the artificial lighting that we have because it's convenient and it helps with safety. But what's really problematic is that pesky street light outside a bedroom window. Those little seemingly insignificant levels of light actually really disturb sleep by interfering with secretion of a hormone called melatonin, which I'll chat about now. But more importantly, it's the light that's coming off our handheld devices or devices that are in close proximity to our eyes that is most concerning, because not only is the light from these devices often quite bright in nature, but often, oh, for heaven's sakes, I'm sorry, guys. It's the short wavelength blue light that we find to be incredibly disruptive, or it's actually a very alerting light. So we've evolved to be very sensitive to blue light or short wavelength light because that's the frequency of outdoor light, which we require to synchronize us to our light dark cycle. But exposure to that at nighttime is very, very disruptive to sleep. And the reason being is that light directly entrains our master clock, which resides in the suprachiasmatic nuclei in the hypothalamus. And then that signal of light or dark or day or night essentially is transmitted to the pineal gland, which in the absence of light will then secrete melatonin, which is one of the key hormones that messages the sort of signal to the rest of the body that it's time to move from wake phase into sleep phase. And so that's an important hormone for setting up the time of day at which we start to feel sleepy and are inclined to sleep. And with melatonin being suppressed by light at night, this can interfere with our sleep timing. And so this little study here looked at that, where individuals were given an opportunity to read before bedtime, just for a normal week, Monday to Friday. And in the 4 hours prior to bedtime, they had either access to the standard sort of hard copy or book, the old-fashioned type, or to a Kindle, which was an e-reader. And essentially, what they noted is that those in the e-reader group, by the end of the week, they were less sleepy in the evenings and took longer to fall asleep, had suppressed melatonin levels, and delayed dim light melatonin onset. And they also had less REM sleep, so it interfered with the structure of their sleep, and they felt more tired the next morning. So it was just some preliminary evidence from this pilot study, which has really been built on subsequently to show that light exposure at nighttime does interfere with our sleep by delaying our sleep timing. And of course, if we are still required to be up early for work or for school or whatever, it really just means that we are having a very shortened sleep opportunity and setting ourselves up for chronic sleep deprivation. So the short-term consequences of poor sleep relate to increased stress responsivity on one hand. Our sympathetic nervous system is typically overactive as it's working really hard to keep us awake in the absence of recovery sleep. And so we become much more responsive to stress, which is not great from an inflammatory perspective as well. We also notice a lot of somatic problems. So people with short-term sleep debt will often complain of headaches or gut issues or knee pain, for example, or joint pain. There are the obvious changes that affect our mood and our cognition. And then we also see changes in our behavior and sort of dietary choices. So when we're acutely sleep deprived, we typically feel a bit sorry for ourselves and we'd prefer not to exercise if we didn't have to. So we might often choose to be more sedentary, and we make poorer food choices. Often when we're sleep deprived, we will choose food that is salty or sweet over that which is more healthy. And so over time, this obviously can impact our metabolic health as well. This little infographic here just shows the effect of sleep deprivation on immunity. And so in this particular study, they measured individuals' sleep and then grouped them as the less than 5-hour sleepers or those that slept 5 to 6, 6 to 7, or more than 7 hours regularly. Then they infected everybody with the rhinovirus and quarantined them and observed who developed symptoms. And they saw that those who regularly slept less than 5 hours were 4.5 times more likely to develop symptoms compared to those who slept 7 hours. And so this really just adds to what we know, that sleep is critical from an immune perspective. Sleep's also really important for productivity. And so the RAND organization has tried to model some of this and looked at the estimated productivity losses attributed to sleep deprivation globally. And so you can see, for example, in the US, they attribute that sleep deprivation due to low levels of productivity attributed to sleep deprivation is modeled to cost the economy around 2.28% of their GDP. And you can see that that's around 2.9% in Japan. They estimate that the US loses an equivalent of about 1.2 million working days annually due to insufficient sleep. And they've estimated that if those who sleep less than 6 hours just edge it up to 6 to 7, so that's not even necessarily within the healthy range, that could add around 226 billion to the US economy. I'm not going to spend a heap of time on this, but just to note that sleep and mental health are inextricably linked. This is the one area of sleep that has been very, very well studied over many, many, many decades. And there is practically not a mental health condition which doesn't go hand in hand with some kind of sleep troubles. And so we know that acute sleep deprivation impacts mood and can increase symptoms for mental health challenges like depression or anxiety. And then also, once a person becomes stressed, for example, once anxiety or depression levels increase, that can also feed back in a two-way manner to further contribute to sleep deprivation. Individuals with insomnia or other sleep-related disorders are more likely to have mood or mental health challenges and vice versa. And of course, sleep deprivation is a consequence of our sleep disorders as well. If we were to look at the prevalence of chronic sleep problems in the general population, it would be at around 10 to 15%, whereas the prevalence amongst those who have diagnosed mental health disorders, the prevalence of sleep problems increases to 50 to 80%. So when we think about the longer term consequences of poor sleep, not only does it increase the risk for or exacerbate our mental health conditions, but it also has a massive impact on our cardiometabolic health. So, sorry guys. Do I come back? Yeah, there we go. So we know that with short sleep, even 5 days, so really there's an acute effect here, but it builds up over time. Short sleep increases our risk for weight gain and ultimately for obesity. It increases our risk for metabolic diseases, specifically firstly makes us insulin resistant, and then increases risk for diabetes, and also increases our risk for cardiovascular disease. And then more recently, we're becoming acutely aware of the long-term consequences of poor sleep on brain health. And so there's some pretty clear evidence which is beginning to emerge that individuals who are either chronically sleep deprived or even with chronic use of sleep medication are showing signs of premature neurodegeneration in their brains, which has been attributed to chronic short sleep. And so prospective studies show that over time, both long sleep, which is more than 10 hours, and short sleep, less than 6, as well as irregular sleep, are associated with increased all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. And then this little study here, which was undertaken by a student at Stellenbosch University, looked to determine the expected savings in healthcare if 25 to 40-year-olds could be converted into having healthy sleep habits. And firstly noted that amongst the healthcare population, or those with access to I've gone absolutely blank, sorry, to medical aids, typically slept less than 7 hours per night, and that many of them had higher risk of various diseases. But he modeled that the annual cost to a single medical aid scheme of treating life-threatening diseases linked to short sleep was around 22 billion per annum. And then just to end off with, we've had a fair amount of interest in having a look at why sleep is important in the setting of athletes and for athletic performance. It's no surprise that it's important for muscle recovery and motor learning, restoring energy stores, or for example, and also for protecting the immunity of athletes. And so collectively, this review here looked at, well, what do we know in terms of what sleep deprivation will do in terms of athletic performance? And of all of these studies, basically the overall message is that if we are sleep deprived, we can expect to experience approximately a 7.6% reduction in performance, and that its key is time awake prior to the task. So if you're sleep deprived and you're trying to compete in the morning, you'll probably be better off compared to if you're trying to compete in the end of the day, where we can expect about a 0.4% decrease for every hour awake prior to exercise. Sleep, however, we now know is not just important for the actual performance, but its key role seems to be in promoting recovery from training. And we've also observed that if we are able to extend sleep without doing anything else in athletes, we have an impact on their performance. And so sleep is really critical. It enables us to be on our A game because it has far-reaching consequences linked to both physical and mental health, emotional resilience, and also physical and cognitive performance. Sorry, I'm just conscious of the time, so I rushed through that last bit, but I want to just leave some time for questions. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Dale. Sorry, I thought you were still going to talk further, but that was a very informative presentation. I'm going to open the floor to anyone who wants to raise their hand to ask a question, and also in the chat. I see we have already, Taslim beat me to it, to put everybody's details. If you didn't follow Taslim's message in the chat, if you want to have CPD points, please put your HPCSA registration number in the chat, and we'll arrange for the CPD points. And so we'll go to the first question, and that's Willem. Thank you.
Hey Dale, Willem Stassen from Division of Emergency Medicine. Julian, can I ask two questions? In one
That's
sitting?
up to Dale, but I'm sure that'll be okay.
Okay.
Let's go for it.
So the two things I have to ask you is, the first one is around a general individual. If you could give like your top 3 tips of how to improve your sleep health, what would those 3 things be based on the science? Or it can be more or it can be less, but I thought 3 would be a nice one for us to digest. And then the second question might be a little bit more involved, in terms of the shift worker sleep syndrome, I think is what it was called. This is a big problem for us, especially in emergency medicine, where almost all of our workers are shift workers. So here I want us to move a little bit closer to thinking about how we set up our system in order to support these shift workers, because we can't suddenly say stop working shifts, you know. So in summary, the 3 for a general person, what are those 3 things? And then for the shift workers that we have in our system, what can we do to support them? Thank you.
Cool. So the first one, regarding if a person suspects they have poor sleep, first must be able to rule out that it's not coming from any undiagnosed disorder which can be treated, because often sleep is secondary to something else. And then you can spend a huge amount of time trying to manage your sleep, but actually there's something upstream that you need to take care of. So that will be step number 1. In the absence of that, stress. People underestimate the impact of stress. And so just making sure that you've got strategies to manage that is important. And stress relieving activities, and specifically exercise, is huge for managing sleep. And then the last thing would be, when you don't have a lot of time to sleep, because that is the reality of many people, you kind of need to make it count where you can. And so just making sure that you've got an environment that makes sleep really easy for you, so that you can maximize that efficiency. Temperature is important. I hate to say those kind of things because they seem so Mickey Mouse, but in this last little bit of February, we definitely realized how much heat plays a role. So yeah, but people want to know, what can I eat? What can I take in terms of supplements? And the answer is that none of that really has much of an impact besides alcohol and caffeine. Those are the obvious ones. And then the shift work problem, I always think about it like a little bit, it's that goes in the topic of the inconvenient truth, because we're not going to escape shift work in the medium to let's say future, but its consequences on people are huge. So the question is, how do you manage people on shift? And so there are quite a few thoughts around this, but it's tricky. I mean, because you're balancing resources and cost versus being efficient. I mean, having 3 8-hour shifts as opposed to 2 12-hour shifts could be slightly better, because you could angle the shifts better, so that people are more likely to be able to get some sleep in a reasonable period. What you are already doing, which is moving forward over shifts, so going from day to afternoon to night, that's optimal. What we find is super disruptive is when you are flicking between shift patterns too quickly. That creates a lot more circadian desynchronization. So having longer stints on a given shift pattern can be much more helpful, because then a person can re-entrain and stabilize on that pattern. So I guess that's a bit more practical. And then this is going to sound really silly, but I really think it's quite useful. Night owls make fantastic shift workers. it suits their biology massively. And morning types are dreadful shift workers. And so therefore having that 3 8-hour shift pattern could allow the morning types to take morning and afternoon shifts. They are useless in the graveyard shift. And so maybe you could take that into account as well. Yeah, but that's being as stable as possible on a given rotation that I think is actually really helpful. And then the one thing that we look at as well is, because one of the major consequences around circadian disruption, when you are on a night shift pattern, for example, or an afternoon evening shift pattern, we still think it's really useful to try to time meals and specifically, and even exercise, limiting it in that night time, and then maximizing what you can do on either side of your sleep in the daytime, because eating at night has a massive effect on your metabolism and massively increases risk for obesity, regardless of your caloric intake. So trying to limit sort of onboarding of food in that night period is probably quite important. So we're moving a little bit away from like the actual sleep deprivation, which is nearly inevitable, and we're thinking about the circadian desynchronization, because shift work has a bigger impact on circadian desynchronization than sleep, and that's the key.
Great, thank you. That was very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dale. Before we go on to Taslim's question, he was next. I just wanted to know, related to what Willem asked and what you answered now, does that ability to do shift work, if you're a night owl, like you tested me and I'm homozygous and I'm a night owl, does that change with age?
Yeah, it's going to shift a little bit. So like, you know, younger people will definitely be slightly more evening oriented, you know, often into your early 20s. And so like there's a lovely window there to capitalize on that. And then as we age and we move, but I'm really speaking now beyond our 50s. So in the twilight years of your working career, you will then shift towards becoming more morning oriented. So that capacity to do the night work that you might have had previously is probably going to be challenged.
I'm horrified to hear that I'm in my twilight years. But anyway, moving on to Taslim. We had a couple of questions in the chat as well, which I'll take after Taslim's question, and then on to Leonard. Go ahead, Taslim.
Hi, thanks. Great talk, Dale. The medical shift work has already been asked. I'm not going to ask that. I want to ask you about the accuracy of wearable tech. You know, our wristwatches, because we get a report to say the quality of our sleep. How accurate is that? Second, what's the evidence around taking an afternoon siesta? I mean, my anecdotal experience is absolutely necessary, about 20 minutes. And then third is sleep deprivation and chronic pain. You didn't mention it in your talk, but I wonder if you can talk to that. Thanks.
Cool. So the first question was around wearables. I keep saying every year we must be getting closer, guys. It's so exciting what they're going to be able to do. And the technology is pretty impressive. But I think they're overreaching in terms of what they're doing with the interpretation of the information that they're passing to people. So they're getting better at predicting sort of differences between sleep and wake. They're pretty useless at predicting slow wave sleep. So sleep staging can really only be classified from looking at electrical activity in the brain. There's very high errors around that. They're not too bad. They're getting closer at predicting REM or rapid eye movement sleep. But I would typically throw all of that away and pay very little attention to it. The level of accuracy is enough. We've done a study where we've given people false feedback based on the accuracy limits of actual genuine wearables. And just 1 week of slightly inaccurate feedback, 5% incorrect, is enough to impact a person's sleep and mood. So yeah, I would just be really careful with it. It's nice to look at patterns and to see what are the big ticket items. You can really see sensitivity to alcohol and caffeine specifically. That comes out really nicely, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to the sleep staging at this stage. But every year I say next year, it's going to be the year. So I think we're moving in the right direction. The next question was related to napping. So what you're speaking to is a power nap. So power naps in individuals who are chronically sleep deprived often in the instance of shift workers, for example, can be really useful. What it does is it quickly reduces that sleep pressure by clearing some of that adenosine, which is built up. And so that can then create or remove some of that lethargy and sleepiness. So it can be super useful. But if you are needing to regularly sleep more than that power nap, so once we start to go to 45 minutes or so, then I would say first you've got to check out nighttime sleep. Napping's got to be a plan B in most instances. So first prize, sort out evening sleep. Second prize, build in naps. And I always say that you get a nap license, and shift workers are the front of that queue, as are new parents, as are people who are sick, and as are adolescents, in fact, as well. Yeah, so got to be easy on that. And then sleep and chronic pain. Yeah, I think that was your last question, right? Yeah, I haven't gone into that. It's not really my area, but on the talks that I've listened to from colleagues, so the little, and I don't know exactly how this works, but with chronic pain, we're often stuck in these pain reflex loops, and those seem to be exacerbated with sleep deprivation. So it's very difficult to break those pain cycles. And so chronic pain often is exacerbated by chronic sleep deprivation. And then obviously when a person has pain in the night, then that interferes with sleep as well. So it kind of goes both ways.
Thanks, Dale.
Cool.
Dale, a few questions on the chat before we get to Leonard. The first one was, what does this mean for our current practices around long calls, both for health of professionals and our patients?
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of debate globally around this, and there are some, as I've mentioned, some, I don't even want to say countries because it's not nearly that broad, but there's a huge amount of research that's being done in Sweden and in Norway about these trying to change the shift strategies, so trying to reduce those sort of very long calls to see if that has an impact. They're also looking at what can we do within the hospital environment that changes the lighting, etc., to help better entrain people's circadian rhythms. But I'm not really sure because it's inconvenient, because the reality is that we need to make a change to protect the long-term health of shift workers. They have a ridiculously increased risk for cardiometabolic diseases compared to the general population. But somebody has to have a lot of guts, I think, to be able to try and take this on, because it means that you've got to consider, I think, often spending more money on your employees, essentially, to allow 3 potentially shorter shift patterns. But it's tricky.
Thanks, Dale. The second question was, how common are sleep disorders in children?
Not particularly commonly diagnosed, if that's the question, but it doesn't mean that they're not there, although often they're not quite at the same level. I think that there's often a lot of confusion as well. Like with infants, it's very normal with such immature guts to have very, very bad sleep. And so that usually is something that is grown out of. There's a lot of mistakes made around incorrect training of kids as they start to develop or secrete melatonin from about 6 to 8 weeks, which can create massive sleep-wake problems. And then in the preschool years and early sort of grade 1 or so, then a lot of sort of people start to consider ADD or ADHD, and then that also can link to sleep problems. In fact, that's often one of the first signs that there are problems with attention, and so that can be looked at. But in terms of apnea, for example, it's relatively uncommon, and classic insomnia is also pretty uncommon.
Then the last question on the chat before we go to Leonard is what Heike asked. I've heard about the concept of biphasic sleep. What are your thoughts on this? Is this real?
Yeah. So a lot of people have looked into it. The evidence doesn't suggest that it's any that it's any better for us. So there's a big train of people that were trying to say no, we should be biphasic sleepers, and that's why we have this break in the middle point of our sleep in the night. But the reality is that by sleeping over 2 discrete periods in the 24-hour period, you create more circadian disruption than if you didn't. And we think that that's got worse consequences for your health. So we're not massively excited about biphasic sleep, but it is a pattern that is probably useful for shift workers who are typically not able to get a single stretch of sleep in one sitting.
Thank you. And then to Leonard for his question.
Thanks, Jeroen. Dale, thanks for a really interesting talk. My question is about post-traumatic stress, which is obviously a perceived heightened level of threat, and our sense of hearing and the effect on brain activity during sleep. And I say hearing because, that is a sense that we obviously is active during one of the senses that is quite active during sleep. So, for example, there might be various sounds that we used to and that don't break a pattern, but there will, of course, be sounds that are unfamiliar, which would wake us up. So, really, the question is about what is the effect of post-traumatic stress on our brains, like what actually happens and what happens in those rapid eye movement cycles, etc.
Yeah. So, I mean, people with PTSD that's sort of unmanaged, I suppose, because there's managed and unmanaged, they will definitely have much poorer sleep, and it's mostly around hyperarousal on one hand, but also nightmares, and those two things are driving poor sleep. So the hearing that you're related to is that it's that inability to disconnect from scanning your environment as a threat for safety. So there's overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system during sleep, which can massively impact us. Actually primarily impacts our ability to get into slow wave or deep sleep, which needs the parasympathetic nervous system to dominate. So that's one of the problems. And then, of course, the nightmare part of it is huge, which obviously then leads to very disturbed, broken sleep, but also high levels of sympathetic nervous system activity. And so, yeah, the ways in which people look at managing that, it's sort of, you're going to do it from attack the problem from both sides. So looking at nightmare rescripting, for example, to try to reduce that aspect of sleep, techniques to try and downplay the role of the sympathetic nervous system at the end of the day and during sleep are also a part of the sort of treatment strategy. And then sometimes also cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is also useful. But usually those things, and then of course counseling around the actual trigger as well, although that's very often deep in the past, yeah. But just to say that in South Africa, we have a ridiculous number, for obvious reasons, of individuals who suffer from PTSD, and it's completely and utterly off the radar of the people themselves, let alone healthcare providers. So it is a huge problem.
Right. Thanks, Dale. That was very informative. Thank you so much.
On that note, Dale, I think we've run out of time, so I'm going to thank you for your incredible talk. It was really informative, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way. So thank you for making yourself available to educate us. We know how busy you are. And so thank you to everybody who attended as well.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.